Hello everybody, my name is Ratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Tyrannical, Storming, Bolstering, and of course Prideful, and it is patch day. We have patch 9.0.5 here, it's here now, and we have several changes to a bunch of different dungeons as well. So during this video, when we go dungeon by dungeon, I will explain what has happened to each dungeon, to prepare you for doing them. And of course, there's a huge incentive to do dungeons that didn't really exist last week, which is Valor points. So quick, I mean, you can read the patch notes if you want to read the full details on how they work, and I'm sure there'll be a Wowhead post that gets populated with all the exact numbers for all the different things. But the way it works is you get points from either doing dungeons or doing your callings as well. There's a massive cap at 5,000, which should be a lot of dungeons and stuff to do, and then that cap will go up by 750 every week. So sort of like conquest points in that the cap, goes up slowly over time, and they set a really big number for now to make up for the fact that this is in the middle of the patch, basically. And then you can use it to upgrade your items that you get from the end of the dungeon, or from the Great Vault, theoretically, although it would be weird for a Great Vault item to be lower item level than what you could upgrade with Valor, but maybe you do some low keys, and then in a couple months you're doing higher keys, you could end up upgrading an item out of your Great Vault. Notably, you can't upgrade items that were earned either from this Great Vault that you got on patch day today, or from dungeons or Great Vaults before patch day. So anything after that point in time will be upgradable, but that does mean that you have an incentive to hop into dungeons, particularly the dungeons that drop if there's a best in slot trinket for you at 220 from any dungeon. That's going to be something that a lot of people will be doing this week, is getting that inscrutable quantum device at 220 or the blood spattered scale. So the other side, I'm sure, will be a popular dungeon for people to run. Really anywhere, though, that there's a theoretical 220 upgrade for your character, especially if you're somebody who didn't do all the PvP and fill out all your slots that way. This is going to be a great way to do that. So without further ado, let's start going dungeon by dungeon. We can start talking a little bit about what's happening to all of them. As always, my routes are available on Raider.io every week. In terms of changes this week, there's a little bit more than usual because it's a bolstering week. For the most part, I haven't put in too many fancy bolstering pulls. Fancy bolstering pulls are a good idea, doing stuff like crowd controlling a high health mob, pulling 3 low health mobs, killing them, and then like doing some weird combination pulls with multiple enemies from multiple different packs that have the same amount of health. Those are a good idea. I don't like including them in my routes because I feel like that overly complicates them. So in general, if you see an opportunity to do something like that and my route doesn't suggest it, you should update that for your group if you're comfortable doing it. But for the most part, I've just gone through and made sure that the routes don't include any massive health discrepancies between enemies. I've separated out the littlest mobs from the pulls that they're in. You are going to want to, so some pulls are a little bit, there's health discrepancies in there, so you are going to want to do good target priority this week with bolstering. There's a lot of dungeons where it's kind of inescapable that there will be some mobs that are like twice the health of the other things that are around them, and rather than doing some kind of weird CC for that, if you can't find a way to then combine pulls and be still getting a lot of targets damaged at the same time, you're going to want to prioritize your damage into, if something has twice as much health as the other stuff, do twice as much damage to it as the other stuff. That usually will work out, but it's something you need to be aware of because it's not always as incentivized as it is this week. Also, of course, storming active, so yeah, try not to play melee if you can avoid it. I guess that advice not particularly useful on the day of. So let's go into dungeon by dungeon. We've got the other side as our first dungeon this week. As I mentioned, this is going to be a very popular dungeon for people to run for trinkets this week. So I expect that if you have a the other side key, this is going to be a very easy week to get good people to run it through LFG. That would be a big thing I'd point out, is that people looking for inscrutable quantum devices or blood spatter scales, a lot of Mythic Raiders even will be looking for those items to use their Valor points on. And you can probably get your Keystone carried reasonably effectively, I would say, as a result of that. This is not a dungeon that received any actual changes in the other stuff, like in the patch notes this week. This is a dungeon that was left relatively unscathed. And in terms of bolstering, the main thing you're going to want to watch out for, make sure you don't pull this dragon with other stuff and bolster it up. Make sure you're careful to, not bolster up a spirit if you pull it with other stuff. It's usually not something that you're in too much risk of happening. Some groups will sometimes pull these warlords with this pack. That's not something you really want to mess around with this week in all likelihood. Is worth noting there is a warlord in this pull that you're going to want to focus down. These things have an enrage effect that also prevents them from dying. So if you can't dispel that, you can get in this spot where even if you did the perfect damage to everything, they're still alive with double damage from that enrage effect, with an extra 4 stacks of bolstering, and unkillable for up to 12 seconds. So if that's happening, you need to run away as a tank, and you need to be aware that that's a possibility anytime you're fighting these Risen Warlords, even with good, bolstering DPS management. So do watch out for that. All right, Halls of Atonement. This one, as I mentioned, there's a lot of these little annoying toiling groundskeepers, which last I did this dungeon did trigger on death affixes. Still seems a little bit weird to me. So, although I haven't seen a documented change about that, so if this isn't the case, then that's something that I'll update. But my understanding is that these do trigger on death affixes, so act like they do until you see that they don't, and that's why I've segregated them out into their own pulls rather than being pulled with any higher health mobs. Other than that, this is a very favorable dungeon for most weeks, and this week continues to be like that. You can, even though I have these marked as separate pulls, you can pull them in at the end of a pull and still get all your same effective cleave. It's just, instead of them being in at the start of the pull and then dying, at 30% of the way through the pull, you pull them in when the pack is at 30%, and then they die right at the same time as everything else. A little bit more of an advanced technique, not something you need to worry about unless you are running up against the timer. Miss Tirna Scithe, basically no massive bolstering headaches in this dungeon. A lot of the smaller mobs in the back area do not trigger bolstering, thankfully, so you don't need to worry too much about those. And the rest of the dungeon, kind of plays itself. You do want to watch out here. The Spite Claws do bolster, so don't pull these in with stuff like Tirna Villagers. And remember that the Tirna Villagers die at like 30% health, so it's actually not that bad, this pull here. This is the no-skips route, which assumes you can't skip through here, so that's why we're pulling these things, by the way. Obviously, don't do that if you can have a Night Fae player and skip through here. I've been debating just adding that, because almost every group does have a Night Fae, but it's still not 100% of groups do, so I make sure that the route works for absolutely everybody. But the more common strategy would be, walk on through here on the left, and nice and easy. Nice and easy. Don't make sure not to chain these in to this pull. All right, Plaguefall. This one is a complicated bolstering dungeon that really it's the case that a lot of the same pulls will work, but they require you to be very heads up about bolstering before rather than after everything dies. Another big thing to take note of is the Gushing Slimes do trigger on death affixes. These do trigger bolstering, so it's not too bad usually if you are evenly AoEing everything. But if you're a group that is entirely composed of specs that are like target capped at 5, you're going to want to be really careful, because there's a good chance that those people are damaging the same 5 targets, even if not as all the other, each player might be damaging a different set of 5 enemies, but there's going to be some overlap there, and so you will see health totals of all the slimes falling in very staggered fashion, which is not what you want to have happen with bolstering. So if you are playing a group that is target capped at 5, pull these things 5 at a time, or have your people always be switching to the highest health targets and the highest health clumps of targets whenever possible. It's not the end of the world if these things bolster a little bit towards the end of the pull. It is the end of the world if you pull something else into them and bolster it up to 20, or to 16, whatever the case may be. 20, actually. I think this is 20 mobs. Yeah, it is 20 mobs. Okay. Let's go to Sanguine Depths. Actually, wait, hang on a second. I think Plaguefall, one thing I forgot to do dungeon by dungeon changes. Plaguefall didn't really have a change. Plaguefall had a necrotic change, which we'll talk about later, but the ads on this fight don't trigger necrotic anymore. Not relevant this week. Halls of Atonement, though. Halls of Atonement Part 2. Welcome to Halls of Atonement Part 2. This dungeon did receive some changes this week, which is the Stoneborn MC is 45 seconds instead of 30 seconds, but they do less damage. They do half damage now, but you get a longer uptime on Stoneborn Boon, which is the 10% DR they give you while you have them mind controlled, and half damage, but for an extra 15 seconds. Actually not a big nerf to the total damage that they will be putting out anyways, especially if you're CCing them out of combat and then pulling them into packs. They're going to have a higher percentage of their life effective, right? So not something that's too important, but is worth pointing out. Let's go back to your regularly scheduled dungeon order. All right, so up next is Sanguine Depths. Sanguine Depths, we do have a change to how the dungeon functions. It's a small one, but it is the anima cages are now different. They last for longer, so the cage will be open on the ground for a minute rather than being open for 45 seconds, and the buff it gives you will last for 75 seconds rather than 60 seconds, and it will trigger off of any enemy rather than just the big ones, which is a pretty important change, actually, that'll let you get more stacks from a lot of these areas and refresh your stacks more quickly. One tactic that this is going to open up is something you would have seen in the MDI, where groups will run from cage, and then by the time they get to the next cage, they still have a couple seconds left on their buff. They quickly kill an enemy, and they refresh up to a high number of stacks rather than dropping off those first stacks. That's something that you might even be able to do now on live keys, depending on your keystone level, especially because they increased all of these times. It's going to make it way more forgiving to try and make something like that work. So look for opportunities to do that. Don't go out of your way too much to make that happen if it's going to cause any problems with your group as well. They've also moved one of the anima cages away from a patrolling chamber sentinel. My suspicion is that that's going to be the anima cage that was right here, because this is a patrolling chamber sentinel. So I don't know where they put it. My guess would probably be they put it over here, but we'll see. I haven't looked in PTR. That's something I should have done, where they moved that anima cage to. So we'll find out. I'll update the route if need be. If they moved it to this area, then we'll do this pull to get that cage. But otherwise, should be fine as is. And the rest of the dungeon, yeah, also should be fine as is. Of course, watch out for storming in the tighter corridors of this dungeon. Make sure that you're thinking ahead about where you're going to fight packs and don't get cornered in a small space. There's no other changes to how the dungeon functions with the patch, so everything else is as you remember, and this buff is pretty sizable if you do have a Venthyr player in your group, which to me it's a little weird they buffed this because it felt like Venthyr was already really strong in this dungeon, but I think that a lot of particularly the fact that you didn't get it from the smaller enemies, left a lot of less coordinated groups really feeling like it didn't do much, but this is a really powerful effect. It's 5% health and damage per enemy that you kill, stacking up to 10, so stacking up to 50% health and damage, or healing and damage. That's a lot. That's a lot of value for a Covenant-specific dungeon buff, so and it's even more powerful now that it's a lot easier to maintain and a lot easier to stack up. Spires of Ascension is a dungeon that has had no changes in patch 9.0.5. It is one that's somewhat likely to be a pretty popular choice for people looking for trinkets. This dungeon has the haste trinket that a couple specs use, so it's another one where you might see a lot of keys done of this dungeon this week, and it might be a relatively easy one to list yourself in the group finder and get invited, or get pretty high geared players interested in running your keystone, so do be on the lookout for that. That's a good thing to be aware of for this dungeon. I'm not 100% sure where all the good trinkets are, but I think most of them are the other side, and the one in Spires is a pretty popular one as well. So also there's a Theater of Pain one. So if you have any keys, my suspicion is that there's going to be a lot of people looking for specific dungeons. So if you are listing your key, I think you're going to get a huge amount of pretty overqualified applicants this week. By contrast, that means if you are applying to keys this week, unless you're already unless you're turbo geared, you're probably going to have more trouble than in previous weeks even getting invited. And I know it was already bad in the group finder. So be ready. My guess is that the best strategy for doing a lot of keys this week is going to be listing your own key. That's always true, but I think it's going to be even more true this week because I think people are really going to be looking for their specific dungeons that have specific items for them. And even if you don't pick a dungeon that has like a good trinket, there's going to be people that need random, verse crit bracers from some dungeon. I guess not verse because you can get that from PvP, but some other stats that aren't versatility. People are going to need, and they'll go grab it from dungeons. So, yeah, that's kind of that's not Spires of Ascension specific advice. But I'm going to say that was the Spires of Ascension bit, because I don't really have anything else to say about this dungeon. All right, on to Necrotic Wake. This dungeon has also seen no changes in the patch. And I know last week I said that I was looking for new ideas on how to path this dungeon, how to route this dungeon. A couple people sent those in, and I haven't had time to actually go through and update everything yet, so the paths mostly are the same for previous weeks. Made a couple of updates for Bolstering, although it's kind of tough to make this dungeon a perfect Bolstering dungeon, so there's a couple spots where you're just going to have to do some priority damage as well. And yeah, then hopefully for next week I'll make some more sweeping changes to the Necrotic Wake path, because I'm still not happy with how they are every way. So definitely, if you have a route that you think does better in this dungeon, use that this week, and next week I'll have a 100% better look. Of course, my no skips and with skips routes are a little different, but I think both have some big rooms for improvement, especially getting some nice pride timings and everything. It's not something I'm fully happy with yet. So again, thanks if you're one of the people who sent me ways that you do this dungeon. I'm going to look through all those and form a good consensus, option for this thing for next week's routes. Okay, Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain, another dungeon that's going to be popular for people to run because there's that trinket in here that people like. And in terms of affixes, this is a pretty great dungeon for bolstering. There's a couple of spots where there's some stuff that can get bolstered depending on how you target priority. This pull, for instance, you're going to need to be a little bit careful of with bolstering if you pull these things in early and kill them really fast. So usually I would wait to pull into them until this stuff is pretty low or some of the mobs are already dead. It's really, the thing about bolstering in medium-sized pulls is it is often worse to overcompensate for things and split things into two pulls rather than just dealing with a couple of mobs that have 20% health and damage from like one thing dying early or things getting a little bit bolstered towards the end. So as long as it doesn't kill you, it's often still a time save to do stuff like that. But if you can avoid it, obviously you should. But my suspicion is that this is still going to be faster to not fight as two separate combats. And then, of course, in this area, you're going to want to either prior damage this thing or just kill it off first. Not a big deal either way. And that's the dungeon. That is Theater of Pain. Another, again, very popular one. This one did receive some changes in the patch, which is that the Covenant buff is 6 minutes rather than 5. But also Zira the Underhanded, which is the stunny mob that could show up. A lot of people didn't know this existed, but here she is. She'd show up and stun you until you CC'd her during this fight, during the first boss fight. She was kind of one of the, this is kind of a 4 boss fight, not a 3 boss fight, but you didn't actually have to kill her. But I think that either she was a little buggy or people were just confused about what was going on or didn't know what the counterplay was to her. And so they've just removed her. She's entirely gone. Boop, not part of the dungeon anymore. So I guess that's nice. It is Tyrannical, so it's nice that the boss will get a little bit easier. But I never really remembered this being one of the bosses that caused the most trouble in this. This was always one of the bosses where whenever you do this dungeon and this boss is really, really hard, you're like, oh no, what is Gorchop and Zav gonna be like, right? So I suspect it'll be even more the case now that it doesn't have Zira there, mixing things up. Anyways, those are the dungeons. That is this week in Mythic Plus. Hope you liked the video. We will be back next week with another one, and this week I will probably do some more WoW stuff because I got to start gearing up my alts. Got to start getting that Valor points now that those are out. We'll see exactly how much I do. I got to do some raiding on my alt as well. We're starting up alt raid as well, so that'll be a fun project to get going. Also may have some maybe some Hearthstone Battlegrounds or Teamfight Tactics or Path of Exile content as well on this channel at some point in the future. I'm not 100% sure if I will create content for any or all of those games and exactly what that would look like yet, but watch this space. You may see some more of that soon, and I may end up moving it to another YouTube channel, although I kind of don't like doing that, so I'll think about how I best want to do that. But either way, you won't miss it. I'll at least announce it here if I am going to fire up another channel for other kinds of content. And I'll try and make some more WoW-specific stuff. I know there's been a lot of people clamoring for like tier lists and stuff, and I will try and create some stuff in that space over the coming amount of time. I don't know. I have some further evolutions of the content that I did last expansion that I want to try and work on, but we'll see exactly how all that looks. Anyways, that's been this video. Hope you liked it. Oops, I don't know if you heard that, but anyways, that's the end of the video. Thanks everybody for watching. Check out my stream, twitch.tv/ratnews. hit like and subscribe and stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.